start out and tell you a little bit about my story. I have bipolar disorder. I was diagnosed when I was 43. And as I look back on my experiences, I started having severe anxiety at age 12. I had my first mania when I was in my 20s. Severe suicidal depressions after that. And finally, in my 40s, got a diagnosis. So my motivation to help kids is I don't want them to suffer until they're in their 30s. I wish someone had been there for me. And I should tell you, my mother went to her grave saying the psychiatrists and counselors were all wrong. I had nothing wrong. I had no disability. And so that was the environment I grew up in. The mental illness simply did not exist. And it was not relevant to me in any way. And my mom lived to 83 and still believed that. So that's my personal story. That's why I care about this issue and have been working on it since about 1997. I worked for Health and Welfare at that time, and we went to State Hospital North in Orofino to talk about the public mental health system. And there was a gentleman who was a patient at the hospital who came to the public meeting, and he kept saying stigma is worse than the illness, and we need to do something about stigma. I was recently diagnosed within weeks of that meeting. And as I drove home, I said, what skills do I have to do something about stigma? Everyone on this video conference has skills to do something about stigma. So what I want today is to kind of deconstruct stigma. I think a lot of times we don't understand what it is, how it develops in us, because all of us have a certain level of stigma toward people with mental illnesses, or toward ourselves as someone with a mental illness or a child. What are the types of stigma, and what can we do about it? What are effective ways to put our energy into doing something about stigma? So you see on my first slide this picture that says end bigotry and begin tolerance. That's what we want to try to do. Here's a quotation from Glenn Close, who is, in addition to her acting, is an advocate for mental illness. And she says that the mentally ill frighten us and embarrass us, and so we marginalize these people who most need our acceptance. Stigma is marginalization. Reducing stigma increases acceptance and the ability of a person to live a full and productive life in their community. That's what we want for our kids, isn't it? A full and productive life. So when I define stigma, this is how I define it. I haven't seen it defined this way anywhere else. But I define it as someone who is profoundly discredited and held apart as a tainted other. Okay? And I put profoundly in there for a reason, because as you experience stigma, you understand how profound it is. It isn't a stereotype. It's a deep-seated behavior that results in discrimination and intolerance. So what does stigma look like? Well, it's a negative judgment based on a personal trait. Now, if I were to just define stigma as that, would it be as powerful as saying it is profoundly discrediting? Absolutely not. This doesn't go far enough. It is always involved in a power relationship. So someone is part of the in culture or the rejected culture. I am someone without a mental illness, therefore I have a higher stature in this world than the person with a mental illness. So it's a power relationship. And when you talk about stigma, you talk about it in connection with a variety of groups, Black people, Hispanic people, Asian people, LGBT folks, women, So there is a power relationship involved. It is formed through attitudes, language, and behaviors. Language affects what you believe about something or your attitudes about it, which in turn affects your behaviors. Those are along a continuum. So when we talk about stigma in terms of the words we use, we really are talking about someone's attitudes towards people with mental illnesses and how they ultimately behave toward them too. Also, as we noted from the previous speaker, stigma extends to parents, to other family members, and to mental health providers. They are also stigmatized because of the population they work with. So stigma always involves shame or disgrace. It promotes secret keeping. And I'll talk about a little bit later about how secret keeping keeps you from getting help and hinders your ability to recover and be a full and productive person. It's generated by cultural transmissions of negative attitudes and behaviors. We'll talk a little bit more about that. The interesting thing about stigma is that there have been a number of studies that indicate that stigma is worse in the rural areas than it is in the nation's urban areas. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that in rural areas, everybody knows your business. There are keeping no secrets in a small rural community. So that is one of the factors there. And stigma leads to discrimination. So what we want to talk about is inclusion instead of exclusion. Living in the everyday world of other community members rather than living in an excluded housing facility. It's supported jobs, living and breathing in the community with everybody else. We want to talk about dignity and worth instead of shame, respect as a contributor in one's community instead of disrespect, and acceptance instead of rejection. And acceptance means that I, as a person without a mental illness, believe that people with a mental illness are just like me. They have the same desires, they have the same needs, and they want human relationships just like everybody else. So how does stigma develop? Well, I look this at a frame of communication because that's my background. Social scientists may look at it a little bit differently. This is my lens on it. So when we are little children and we turn into toddlers, we begin to learn the labels, the words to describe the world around us. Okay, I'm experimenting, I'm learning mommy, daddy, brother, sister, the dog's name, I'm learning all these words. As I am exposed more to my caregivers and cartoons and whatever, I begin to have a phase called prejudgment, which is when I begin hearing and wondering about the labels that people are using and their behaviors toward other people. And I try to make sense of that. At the next stage, I begin to adopt the stereotypes that my caregivers have too. So I will, at that phase, if I accept, and I usually do because I'm a kid, that my caregivers believe that everybody with a mental illness is violent, I will begin to believe that too. And I'll believe it about a whole group of people. Okay, so you can see how we've gone from just labeling the world to having judgments about the world. And then finally, in the last stage, I begin to act on those things. This is where discrimination starts happening. We all go through this conditioning process. And as parents of people with mental illnesses, we have a role, a significant role in this language and attitude behavior and teaching our kids how to act appropriately toward people with mental illness. So there are three general types of stigma. Anyway, I put them into three categories to better understand them. There's social and cultural stigma. This is what we talk about most when we talk about stigma. Structural and institutional stigma. These are the processes and structures that institutions create that perpetuate stigma, and self-stigma, which is when I believe what the world is telling me about me as a person with a mental illness. Okay? So 3 general categories. So let's look at social and cultural stigma, and you're all familiar with a lot of this, but this includes stereotypes of things like all people with mental illness are stupid, or they're childlike, we have to take care of them, or they're violent, or they're all geniuses and creative. Okay? So you can be positive stereotype. All of us with mental illness can be Van Gogh. Okay? And then we begin to think that there is no differentiation by individual person. If all of us can be Van Gogh, for heaven's sakes, what about the person with a mental illness who wants to be a mathematician? Right? So when you apply this to whole groups, you begin to discriminate against them and put them and pigeonhole them. So when we look at what happens in the social sphere, how people behave, we have people who will hire folks with mental illness. We have people who don't want to live next door to people with mental illness, and heaven only knows we have people who don't want their daughter to marry someone with mental illness. And when you look at measuring stigma, how the scientists measure stigma, it is through what they call social distance. So your level of stigma is higher based on how far away, literally, how far away you want to be from someone with a mental illness. So you may not want them even living in your town. So your level of stigma is higher than you may not want them living next door. So your level of stigma is higher than the person who says, well, they can live in the community as long as they live across town. Okay? So it's that distance. Okay. And now, a lot of times, social and cultural stigma is done naively, based on this development we've had as human beings. We don't even know we're doing it. We don't think about it. And so it's important then, when we want to reduce stigma, is to call attention to when stigma happens, to interrupt it, and help people understand how what they've said or done is stigma. Now this plays out in the mass media too. Over 60% of the people in this country get all their information about mental illness from the mass media. And what does that coverage look like these days? It's all about violence and guns. Now there are some reporters out there who are trying to do mental health stories, who are trying to insert that into dialogue, and some politicians are trying to do that, and certainly we are all trying to do that. But nevertheless, the image of people with mental illness is being portrayed as violent. So one of the things in social and cultural stigma is labeling. And this is the vocabulary we use to describe people with mental illness. And this little boy says, I'm dealing with depression, stupid names don't help. So when I talk to kids, they use words like psycho or loony or schizo. Some of them even say short bus when you ask them about people with mental illness. I don't know if you know what that is, but the special ed kids will ride in a shorter bus, special bus, and so they label those kids short bus. And another thing they'll do almost all the time is use the word retard, which is derogatory toward people with developmental disabilities, but it's not even accurate when you deal with people with mental illness. So that labeling is a manifestation of social and cultural stigma. Structural and institutional stigma. Think about your church. Think about emergency departments. Think about institutions that determine disability payments, how they want you to focus on your weaknesses and how bad you're doing in order to get a benefit. When for your recovery you need to be focusing on what you can do, not what you can't do. Okay, so think about those kinds of institutions in your lives and what kinds of things they may or may not be doing as part of their systems that send a message of stigma. So self-stigma. Again, this is what members of the stigmatized group may do to themselves if they internalize the public stigma. So you begin to believe what people are thinking and saying about you. So I may believe that I'm stupid, I'll never hold down a job, I deserve this shunning, and I am maybe less competent than other people. Think about the implications for recovery. Think about the implications for a child in school who is telling him herself those messages. And so it promotes secret keeping. How does this impact treatment? Well, if I'm keeping a big secret and I don't want to acknowledge this, I'm not going to go for treatment, am I? Because that would acknowledge all this pain I'm going through as a result of stigma. So in treatment, consumers avoid the label of mental illness and harm it brings and decide not to fully participate in care. You'll see I have highlighted not to seek or fully participate in care. I never use the word compliance or adherence. Those are stigmatizing, aren't they? It implies a power relationship between a medical provider and a person with a mental illness. I need to adhere and comply with this powerful person says that I need to do. I never use those words at all. I choose not to seek or fully participate in care. That may be because of stigma, and it may be because of side effects of medication, or it may be that I am, or my family is resistant to the idea of the diagnosis. What if I had listened to my mother and not gotten treatment? I would not be here. I would not be in this world. So stigma supports the therapeutic relationship between the mental health provider or the physical health provider and the consumer. Okay, why do I use the word consumer? People don't like the word consumer. I'm a person with a mental illness. I think I can use that word if I want to. And I use it because I find it empowering. When I go to the grocery store, I'm a consumer. I can pick and choose between peanut butters, between types of black beans, okay? I'm a consumer of mental health services. I can pick and choose. Okay, that's why I use the word. Anyway, that's off the subject. So families avoid talking or learning about a loved one's condition and participating in treatment. They experience shame. You all know that. There's shame. It must be because I'm a bad parent. And there's secret keeping. And all that can conspire to reduce the recovery and resiliency of our children. And it can reduce access to care through blame, indifference, and perceptions of deviance. I was told one time by a legislator who's no longer in office, so don't start guessing. He said he did not believe in mental illness. If you don't believe in mental illness and you're a high-level policymaker, are you going to pass larger budgets for mental health? No. That's a family's problem. Okay? And it isn't real after all. So his belief and his attitude and the language he used were in fact influencing public policy. All right? So blame, indifference, perceptions of deviance. So let's talk about mental health clinicians. Are they stigmatized? You betcha. Are they pill pushers? Do they mollycoddle our children? Do they make excuses for them? So they live through it too, in their own way. So let's talk a little bit about what you can do about stigma. First thing is to understand it, and I hope I've given you a beginner's lesson in understanding stigma, of dissecting it and trying to get in and take a good look at what it is, how it happens, and now we can begin to plan and organize and implement programs and activities to do something about it. But I would submit you can't design a program to do something about it without understanding it first. So there are 4 ways currently talked about for reducing stigma. One is called protest, one is education, and we do a lot of that. One is called contact, and that is when a person with a mental illness or a family member has a direct human interaction with a person who doesn't. And then there is a combination, which I think is most effective, of marketing, education, and contact. So let me talk a little bit about those. Protest methods are legislation, rules, laws, like the Americans with Disabilities Act, which prohibits discrimination in the public sphere. Guess what? Chances are those only work in the public sphere, and in the private sphere, we are still stigmatized. And that has happened with racial minorities, and it's happening with people with mental illness. So I'm going to be tolerant out in public because I have to be, but I don't have to be tolerant at home and with my social circle. Other things that are done to do protests are boycotts. NAMI National does a media watch and gives people bulletins, send out bulletins that tell you which companies to fax to when a program's coming on television that stigmatizes people with mental illness, asking those companies to withdraw their advertising. Okay? Boycotts. The problem here is that we are asking people to stop believing something they've been learning since they were babies. That's your challenge with protests. So the evidence, research evidence, is that these can change attitudes, but the evidence is that it doesn't really change behaviors in the person's social sphere. And I would suggest that flipping that concept to catching people doing something right may be a more effective way than always catching them doing something wrong. So when a reporter writes a good story, a letter to the editor saying, "Good job," no, catch them doing something right. So now we'll look at education. Education's proactive rather than reactive, which is good. Getting in to try to do a positive experience with people. You provide accurate information on which to make decisions. So you're clearing up these stereotypes from the mass media. Most researched method of reducing stigma. A lot of education programs over the years. When we started Anti-Stigma in Idaho, we were the only place that was doing it. Since that time, there's just a whole bunch of activities that have gone on. And this is great strides, isn't it, from when we started in Idaho to huge national campaigns now. This tends to work with teens and the public and mental health consumers who are less likely to endorse stigma based on what they've learned in an educational program. And when I say consumers, I mean reducing their self-stigma. Because through education, they've learned to reject what the society is telling them. Content of education matters, okay? It needs to be factual. People need to understand what to look for and what to do about it. How treatments, there are effective treatments out there. 80 to 90% of the time, people with mental illness can be treated effectively. And understand how people with mental illness want the same things that everybody else does. And of course, we want to talk about the actual prevalence of violence. This is a little problematic these days because most people are equating mental illness with violence, and we have so many visible examples of it in our mass media. So it's a little bit tricky to quote, most people with mental illness are no more likely to be violent than the rest of the population. Let's not buy in that right now. So this is a tricky one, and it warrants further discussion among groups like this around the state about how to deal with that issue. So contact. Contact means that I tell my story to people without mental illness so they will better understand it and get to know me as a productive member of the community. Parents can do this, and people with mental illness can do this. And when a teenager comes before a group and tells their story, I cannot tell you how powerful. Incredibly powerful. It does raise consequences, and people need to think it through before they disclose, because there are potential downsides to it. But we also know that people can benefit from coming out of the closet because they're not holding the secret that they have hidden for so many years. So telling one story. NAMI has the NRL Voice program, which incidentally they stole the name for that from Idaho, just so you know. I'm harboring a little resentment and have been for too many years. Anyway, what we know from personal contact is that changes people's minds and their behaviors do sustain over time. It is much more powerful than just straight lecture education alone. So it's more likely to result in behavioral change. But the message matters. We need to give a positive message. So what I tell parents is, if you're going to give a presentation, don't spend the presentation bashing what happened to your kid in school. Give a presentation on what the ideal system in school would look like. See what I mean? Be positive, because people respond to recommendations and imagination about how things could be in the ideal world. That they start rejecting messages that are critical and accusatory. Think about how you react. And that's how most people react. Okay? So now we look at social marketing. And social marketing is simply this. It is using traditional marketing for selling things like cars and hamburgers and applying it to advance a social cause. And our social cause here is reducing stigma. So you take all the theories of marketing and communication and you apply them to this issue. And this is based on traditional Pavlovian stimulus response. That's what communication is. If I give you a message, I will design that message so you will respond in a particular way. Okay. Here are some examples of materials and toolkits from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration that are accessible to you for free if you decide that you want to take on a protest, an education, a contact, or social marketing to reduce stigma. And these will run you through it step by step. We also still have materials that are relevant and available for the Idaho campaign. And the Idaho campaign won a Peabody Award, won an award from the National Alliance on Mental Illness and the National Education Television Association and a whole bunch of film festivals for a documentary we did featuring 4 Idaho teenagers who talked about their mental illnesses and how it affected their lives. Now, why did we do that? Well, at the time, you couldn't get somebody to talk about their mental illness in Idaho. So we certainly couldn't get one in Coeur d'Alene and Lewiston and Boise and Nampa and all these, we couldn't get enough. So we scraped up 4 who were willing to tell their story and willing to deal with the consequences of coming out. And we put it in a documentary, and that becomes a proxy for contact, right? But videos are very powerful, and folks watch that video, and they have contact with a person with a mental illness, with a teen with a mental illness. That was the only way we could see to reach a large number of people with a contact relationship. Education. We started the Better Today's, Better Tomorrow's Gatekeeper Education Program, which has trained 11,000 people statewide on the signs and symptoms of mental health problems in kids and what to do about it. So there was contact, social marketing, and education. We didn't do protest in this. We decided to use a positive approach to model what it should look like rather than what pass a law or something to telling people they can't do something. How do you pass a law telling people they can't stigmatize? You can't. So we didn't do that. Okay, so when addressing stigma, talk about discrimination in life areas. Don't just talk about the stigma thing that people may or may not understand. Talk about how stigma looks in housing, and in education, and in recreation, and employment. Those are what I mean by life areas. Don't jump to a solution before you've defined the issue. A lot of times I go out and talk to people who want to do something about stigma, and I've already decided what they want to do before they understand whose behavior they want to change and how they want to change it. So creating a speakers bureau may or may not